Africa, because he's talking about Kenya, so Kenya and South Africa.
When I left in 1960, the population estimated, because there was no census, was around 6 million.
In Kenya.
In Kenya, and it's a fairly big country, size of France. So it's a very, very small population. It was essentially empty country. It's now 66 million. It's the country with the biggest population growth of any country in the world. And it's devastating when that happens. It's partly natural birth rate. The median family size is 11. The median small holding is 2 acres. 60-some% of the population is under the age of 15. And there's really no industry. So most people are living subsistence lives. And so that's a demographic catastrophe. No country can deal with anything like that. So,
and are a lot of them refugees from other countries?
Well, yeah, part of it is the 11 children for a family, so natural increase. But it's where I grew up is in a corner bounded by Uganda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So this is about the worst neighborhood in the world for strife and disaster and catastrophe. And so it's overrun with refugees. They pour in across the border because as bad as it is in Kenya, it's much worse in the neighboring countries. Countries like Somalia and South Sudan are humanitarian catastrophes. So that's the big one, was this incredible population growth. When I grew up, the plains were empty and covered with animals. When I went back, covered with little huts and little fields, and the animals gone, except for the national parks. So, very dramatic if you go back.
Sort of, like a culture shock almost?
I'd say, yeah. And I had forgotten the language.
Yeah, I was going to ask, did you speak the language?
I spoke Swahili when I was a small child. It was my first language was Swahili. I learned English when I went to boarding school. But I forgot it because I hadn't spoken it for 30 years. But when I went back and stepped off the plane, it just came pouring back. I could open a dictionary and memorize 100 words, just like that. Well, of course, I wasn't memorizing. I was recalling. And by the time 5 months were up, I could speak quite well, conversationally. But that was 87, and I've forgotten it again. So I can claim to have forgotten the same language twice.
But you can probably also claim that if you go back again, you might remember it.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, probably, actually. That's how our brains work.
And what about South Africa? Did you go back?
Oh, yes, I bought a house in South Africa, and we used to fish the summers here and live in Cape Town in the winters, until Jonathan had to go to school and it got too difficult.
Did you have a preference then over Kenya or South Africa? A preference for...
Here or South Africa?
No,
for South Africa or Kenya?
Oh, South Africa, yes. Kenya is a very difficult place to live.
But your heart?
Yes, if it was the way it was. As a small child, I grew up in a wonderful world. I mean, almost perfect. I grew up in a place with a perfect climate. It was exactly on the equator at 8,000 feet, so there were no seasons. It was always spring. It never changed. The sun set at 6 and rose at 6. Never changed.
Still does.
The lowest temperature my father ever recorded on our farm was 62, and the highest was 82. That was the whole range. Most days, at night it would be 65, 66, and during the day it would be 72, 74.
That's nice.
365 days of the year.
What about rain?
We'd have 2 rainy seasons, but not like this. No. But I had never seen Twilight, for instance. I'd read about Twilight in books. Oh, I was so excited to see Twilight. And I'd never seen Seasons. And then my parents...
Because when it got dark, it got dark. It was
Yes.
light and then boom.
Right. And then when I was 8, my parents took me to Europe. Oh my. Snow and ice and twilights. And it was fantastic. All these things I'd only read about in books.
Well, so when you went to boarding school, did you come to...
No,
you
it was
went
in
to
Nairobi.
England? Oh, it was in Nairobi.
His brother had to go to England. But
My
he
brother
had to go
was sent to England to a boarding school.
And at what age were you in boarding school?
6.
6?
Yeah.
Wow.
Didn't work very well. It's too young.
Is that typical?
Uh,
Or was that a little earlier
It
than
depended. People who lived in areas where there was a lot of malaria, which is me, was to get them out of the malarial areas. And that was one way to do it, send them to high altitude, which is why we ended up living at a high altitude. So, yeah, well, I was dropped off at this boarding school, and every day, as soon as I could, I'd go down to the gate and wait for my parents. Day after day after day, and of course nobody ever came. And finally the headmaster couldn't stand it any longer, and he called up my parents and said, "You better come and get him." So I was taken home, and I was sent back the next year
You were 7.
when I was 7.
By the time you were 7, did you learn not to go to the gate?
Oh, I was a tough kid by then.
Oh. Wow, and so did that last through when you were 16? And then,
Yeah. Various
So-
boarding schools, yeah.
And then did you have summers off so that you would spend some time with your parents in
We were 9
off
months at
seasons?
school, 3 months not, broken up into vacations. Yeah.
Okay.
It was a harsh schooling environment, very different from yours. Yours is infused and informed by kindness. Ours was not. It was sort of a bit like the army. It was presumed that we were worthless, but if we were beaten enough, we'd eventually amount to something. And that's basically how English people were bringing up their children back then. So
Wow.
pretty tight discipline.
And it was an English school, and it was
It was English government, yeah, Church of England school. We started class at 8 in the morning and finished at 5 with half an hour for lunch. Yeah, big difference.
Wow, you must
Any
be really
recess?
Half an hour
Half hour.
for lunch.
No recess or...
No breaks.
No. And then compulsory sports, and then an hour of homework in the evening. So it was a long day.
Mm-hmm.
I think the theory was that if we weren't given a moment to ourselves, we wouldn't get up to anything bad. But we managed quite well. But that said, and the educational system was different, the whole basic philosophy. Here, there's this notion that you can be taught critical thinking and encouraged to think critically. We were not. They stuffed stuff into our heads on the theory that once you had enough stuff accumulated in your head, you'd be able to make relations between this thing and that thing. And that, in the end, is education, where whatever you see, you can relate it to something so that it means something. And it works. It's rather brutal, but it works. So there's 2 ways of doing it. And who knows? The graduates of my little school in my little village have all done remarkably well. So I went to a 60th reunion
Oh, man, that must have been something.
in England because they'd all left Kenya and scattered all over the world. And I thought there'd be a lot of grumpy old people pushing walkers around.
No.
Not a bit of it. They were
They're
trim.
like you.
Yeah.
Huh.
And nearly all of them rich. Who knew? Because they'd gone on and done wonderful things all over the world.
Very enthusiastic about life, very well
Yes.
informed about
So,
current events.
although our school system sounds nightmarish in this context, it seemed to do quite well. But it wasn't kind, and it wasn't informed by kindness. It was quite the reverse.
So did you
about
see? I'm sorry. No, go. I've been asking.
What about your parents? Did you know them very well?
No.
My question is.
No, it was very English. I had to call my father Sir. All his life I called him Sir.
So you just weren't very
So
close.
did you say no or yes?
No.
You didn't know.
Didn't know them very well, no. They were unusually neglectful parents. They had pretty big lives. They were glamorous and fun and interesting, but not really what a small child needed. But we had lots of house servants, one of whom was sort of my keeper. So he was a wonderful old man. He was a Quaker. He didn't speak any English. Well, we suspected he spoke a lot of English, but he refused to admit it. And he certainly wouldn't speak English to me. But he basically brought me up. He was very stern, kind, very conservative, very old-fashioned. And my father had been a government prospector in the 1920s, which meant walking through the African bush with a prospecting hammer, taking rock samples, with a string of porters carrying all the stuff. And to eat, my father would have to shoot something every single day to feed his little caravan. And they were camped one night on the shores of Lake Victoria, and this child came out of the bush, a very skinny child, and hung about. And the next night when they camped, the same child came out of the bush and hung about, at which point my father went, "Oh, there's a problem here." And he instructed the kid to go back to his village and not to follow. And the next night, guess what? And eventually my father just gave in, and he worked for the family for 50 years.
Wow.
And he sort of brought me up.
That was the guy who was your.
My father bought him a bicycle. He was the sort of head of the household, the butler, if you like. There were 6 house servants. My father bought him a bicycle as a present, and he refused to go near it. And my father said, "Why?" He says, "Well, I can't ride one of those." And my father said, "But you could learn." "No," he said, "in learning, I am certain to fall off. And if any of these people saw that happen, I'd lose my authority."
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that is a take on it.
Yeah.
But you were actually quite close to your father in many ways. I mean, you did a lot of things with him.
Yeah, he was dad. So. So. Yeah, it's hard to explain how different it is from one culture to the next. Because it's not the big things, it's the little things that
Make it so different.
are really the huge.
You need to tell them a little bit about your other. He's told you about one home up in the mountains. Tell them about the other home on the coast and what you did there.
Yes, I lived on a farm that was 600 miles inland on the Uganda border on the slopes of a big volcano. It's the last peak in the Ruwenzori range. It's where the mountain gorillas lived. We didn't have any gorillas on our mountain, but it's the same range. It's a 14,000-foot mountain. It would actually snow on a summit occasionally. And we'd race up there, but it would always be gone before we got there. And then my parents had a house on the coast, which is very tropical, one of the hottest places on earth. and it's mostly Arabs. They're black Arabs, but they're from Oman, from Yemen. It's called Yemen now, but back then it was the Sultanate of Oman, and the Omanis had colonized the whole east coast of Africa in the 12 to 1400s, and it was still there. And so my parents had the house on a cliff overlooking a lagoon, but my father couldn't own the land. He leased it from the Sultan of Zanzibar. And once a year, he would go and pay his lease to the Diwali of Zanzibar, who was the Sultan's representative. And I would get taken along. And when I was little, I'd be put in the harem with all the wives, who would make a huge fuss of me and feed me vast amounts of sweeties and things. But when I grew older, I got to go in audience with the Diwali, and it was very formal, and he sat on his throne representing the Sultan, and my father would come in and do salam alaikum, and in Swahili then negotiate the next year's lease and pay the previous year's lease. It was always paid after. It was a trust thing, and it was always paid in coin. They wouldn't accept banknotes. So my father would have a great big sack of coins from the bank. 20,000 Kenyan shillings or whatever the rent was, which would be handed solemnly to an assistant. So, and the house was beautiful. It was, hello. Hi. The house was beautiful. It was a big Arab house with enormous high ceilings. And the thing that struck me most, it was many floors with stairs that went up, no banister, no stair railing. You were free to plunge into space if you wished. Never understood it. Very luxurious houses, built around a courtyard, because they live with inward-facing houses, and no non-family member may enter. You entertain the family, you entertain people in a sort of forecourt, which is open to the street, but you never get to see the interior of the house. I got to see the interior of the Diwali's house because I was, being a child, I was allowed to go into the harem. But that was it.
And so how do you describe a harem?
There were, to me, a whole lot of old ladies. There were 4 or 5 ladies there, and I presume they were the Diwali's wives.
So it was like multiple wives of this one guy.
Yes. And they were really nice and fun.
Tell about fishing.
Hmm?
Tell about fishing. Your dad's fishing business, and you.
My dad had a charter business with taking tourists, or at least wealthy people actually, because it was way back then, out to catch sailfish and marlin, that kind of thing. And the people who ran the boats were these Arab people who are extremely fundamentalist Muslims, very stern, very strict, very upright, kind of terrifying actually. And really fine people. It's unfortunate that we've seen fit to make war on them, mistakenly in my opinion. But the fishermen themselves were remarkable. They fished with their eyes. Eyesight was everything. And if they wanted you to catch a marlin or a sailfish, you would catch one. And if they didn't want you to catch a sailfish or marlin, you wouldn't catch one. But the problem with that is my father had a policy: if you didn't catch anything, you didn't pay. That was so. We advertised that we would have an English-speaking person on every boat. So from quite young, I was sent out to be
You were that person?
that English-speaking person. So I learned to mediate between Belgian and American wealthy people on a vacation, and very fundamentalist Muslim men. And it was very difficult because the customers were constantly doing things which were sinful, impure, violated the law. And so it was my job to square it up and make sure that the customers got fish. But the way they would find the fish was looking for birds. And they'd say, over there, and I would look, and I had very good eyesight, and I would see nothing. And I'd say, oh, nonsense, you're just making this up. And we'd head over there, and sure enough, after about 15 minutes, oh, okay.
Tell them about Blind Boy.
About?
Blind Boy coming back from school.
Oh, well, I used to be sent off to this boarding school for like 3 months, where you sit doing what you're doing, reading. And when I'd get back to the coast and go out on the boat again, by the end of the time out on the boat, I could see as well as they could. But when I'd come back from school, I couldn't see anything because your eyes adjust to whatever you're doing. So they refer to me as the blind boy. Here comes the blind boy. But after about 3 weeks, I could see again. And then they'd make jokes about how I'd been healed and cured. And I shouldn't go to that wretched school because it was going to make me blind.
Tell them about how your career ended.
My fishing career there?
Yeah.
Oh, it's a slightly unsuitable tale. It's a bit gruesome.
Tell it.
Oh, now we want to know.
Some of our customers were really bad. Bad people. Very wealthy, arrogant people. Doing the African safari thing. And a lot of them in the 1950s, 60s, very racist. And I must have been about 14 or 15. It was towards the end. And to get to the boats, there was a stone jetty, but the boats were all anchored out in the bay because there was always a swell rolling in. There was no nice, gentle harbor like this. So we had these lighters, these big wooden rowing boats with 4 oars and a crew. And so this would come alongside the stone jetty, and you'd jump in, and it was kind of scary because this thing is going up and down and smashing against the rock jetty. And so, you know, they were very good. They'd pull in and they'd ship their oars, and you leapt in, and you're gone again out to the boats, and then shipped out the boats. Anyway, this man arrived, an American, and he was very loud and very rude right from the beginning to all these crew. And he objected to the way we were loading the boat. He objected to everything, but he finally got in and he sat down and he did this. He put his hands on the gunwale.
Oh, no.
And the crew chief shouted, "Take your hands off." And he said, "I ain't gonna let no nigger tell me what to do." And at that moment, the boat smashed and cut his hand off.
Justice. Sorry.
And it was amazing
Round of applause.
because he didn't bleed. His hand went blue. It cut his fingers off. His hand went blue. It didn't bleed, and his fingers sank. I mean,
Wow.
and I glanced up, and the crew had grins from ear to
I'll
ear.
bet.
I don't understand how that ended your career, though.
Well,
and
my
not
father
theirs.
was watching
Okay.
and went,
Makes sense.
Oh, he was actually.
"Oh, this is not right for a 14-year-old child to be
It's like, I changed my mind.
mixed up in this stuff." So I didn't have to go on the boats anymore. And by then I hated fishing. I was never, ever going to fish. Guess what?
Never say never.
What made you want to be a pilot, though?
Wait, can I pause this for a second?
Yeah, we're kind
'Cause
of
I
just
have to-
talking
I
now,
have
so
to
I feel
go.
like we should just turn it off. It's like an hour and a half.
Yeah.
I know you should just do Andrew and
Yeah.
call it good.
Yeah, we're almost, we're like
Yeah.
out of time anyway.
Yeah.